द वे फॉरवर्ड इज ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਬਹੁਤ-ਬਹੁਤ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਹੋਸਟ ਹਰਜੋਤ ਸਿੰਘ। ਜਿਵੇਂ ਕਿ ਪਿਛਲੇ ਹਫਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਸੀਗਾ, ਅਸੀਂ ਲੌਂਗ ਆਈਲੈਂਡ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕੀਤੀ ਸੀ। ਅਸੀਂ ਕੁਝ ਐਸਪੈਕਟਸ ਕਵਰ ਕੀਤੇ, ਕੌਣ ਲੋਕੀ ਸੀਗੇ ਜੋ ਇੱਥੇ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਸੀਗੇ 1600 ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ, 1600 ਦੇ ਅਰਾਊਂਡ ਜਦ ਇੱਥੇ ਯੂਰੋਪੀਅਨ ਸੈਟਲਰਸ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਨੇ, ਕਿਵੇਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਡਿਵੈਲਪਮੈਂਟ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ, ਕਿਹੜੀ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀਜ਼ ਆਉਂਦੀਆਂ ਹਨ, ਔਰ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਤਕਰੀਬਨ ਐਂਡ ਆਫ 18th ਸੈਂਚੁਰੀ ਤੱਕ ਅਸੀਂ ਪਹੁੰਚ ਗਏ ਸੀਗੇ। ਐਜ਼ ਵੀ ਟੋਲਡ ਯੂ, ਅਸੀਂ ਰਿਕੁਐਸਟ ਕੀਤੀ ਸੀਗੀ ਜੋ ਸ਼ਰੈਮ ਨੂੰ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਰੁਕਣ, ਔਰ ਹੋਰ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ ਪ੍ਰੈਜ਼ੈਂਟ 2022 ਤੱਕ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਨੂੰ ਆਪਾਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਈਏ। ਸਾਰੀ ਇਕਨੋਮਿਕ, ਸੋਸ਼ਲ, ਪੋਲੀਟੀਕਲ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹੈ ਲੌਂਗ ਆਈਲੈਂਡ ਦੀ, ਉਸ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰੀਏ। ਜੋ ਥੈਂਕ ਯੂ ਸੋ ਮਚ for giving us that invaluable information last week, and staying back and continuing this very important conversation with us.
My pleasure.
All right, Joe, last week we finished talking about who were the people who were on the island till around 1890s, right?
Sure.
So after, when we left, you said that the country had a bloom, economic, a real boom after end of slavery, after, end of Reconstruction. And that's a period in New York called the Gilded Age.
Right.
Can you tell us more about that?
Well, sure. The Gilded Age started early in the New York area because the Civil War had ended. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason why the North had won was because it had railroads. Okay. And the railroads were a significant part of the development of wealth in this country. Mm-hmm. And so a good number of the railroads originated from New York. Also, while the South was going through Reconstruction, mm-hmm. The cotton industry was coming back, mm-hmm. but the cotton traders settled in New York, mm-hmm. because that's where the New York traders, where they could do business, and the cotton was shipped over to Europe. So railroads played a significant role, and what was happening is that people were becoming very wealthy. Mm-hmm. And the incredible wealth that was generated is now called the Gilded Age. Mm-hmm. That was a term created by Mark Twain, the writer, mm-hmm. and in his book called The Gilded Age. It was really about the excesses of wealth. But all that time, mm-hmm. Long Island played a significant role in the Gilded Age because many of the wealthy people built their estates and their mansions on Long Island. And the Long Island people made money from these people by working with them or working for them.
So these people, you said, they started building their houses on the Long Island. Where were they living earlier?
Excuse me.
Were they living in Manhattan earlier and they started moving to Long Island?
Some, but not all. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. The Vanderbilts, mm-hmm. were a family that were Dutch from Staten Island, but they were not part of that Knickerbocker society we had talked about last week.
Isn't that a Dutch name?
It is a Dutch name, but they weren't wealthy Dutch people until the Gilded Age. Mm-hmm. And they made their money from railroads and shipping. Originally shipping and then railroads. Mm-hmm. And so they lived in New York City, but they built their country homes on Long Island. There was and so they built estates. Originally, what was most recently called Dowling College in Oakdale, Long Island, and it's very sad because the building is empty and sitting there on the riverfront and sort of decaying. And but that was the home of William Vanderbilt and his wife Alva, mm-hmm. and so that was the beginning. And there was the reason why they came here was because they were interested in hunting, mm-hmm. and fishing, and originally they came here for that. And then ultimately they came here for sailing, and they came here for polo, and so the Gilded Age just kept growing with these sports of leisure. And as they built their homes and their mansions, the Long Islanders who lived here became more wealthy themselves.
Selling them land?
Excuse me, yes. The Quakers in the old Westbury area sold them land. And then one Quaker family called the Hicks family were in the nursery business, and they still are. And they would sell them trees, full-grown trees, that they would transplant onto these estates, so the estates looked like they'd been there for hundreds of years, as opposed to being brand new. And the Hicks family were a Quaker family. And
is that the family that Hicksville is named after?
Yeah, there's a town called Hicksville, and it is a major terminus on the Long Island Railroad. Not terminus, major train station, and it's named after one of the Hicks family, and he had been president of the Long Island Railroad. So the Long Island Railroad, developing on Long Island, helped to also bring more people out to Long Island to work on these estates or work on farms or in businesses that supported the Gilded Age economy.
And there were some of the wealthiest people in the country living in New York at that time, right?
Oh, sure. Now there were all these folks who lived in other parts of the country and had made money in different ways, like in silver or gold mines or oil or whatever, and so and steel. And so people, and all the business were interrelated, and banking, of course, the Morgan family. So everybody came to the New York area, and then they lived in New York City, and they needed a weekend house. So many of them came to Long Island.
So Long Island was mostly their weekend houses for the rich.
Yes, Long Island had was really initially was the weekend home. They would come out here on weekends or and spend the summer until they started going to Newport, which in Rhode Island, which was their summer home or their summer cottage, as they called it.
They say New York made the most progress during those times, right? Around 1890, right up till World War I.
Yes, there was a tremendous amount of economic growth here. We are talking about these grand estates and these grand mansions, but Long Islanders were making a good deal of money, and so they were putting their money into fanciful homes. Like there was a community called Seacliff, and I will show you a house, a Victorian style house in Seacliff, and that so that you can see that house. They spent a lot of money on other extravagances. This house is special.
Is that the house on Seacliff you're talking about?
That is a Seacliff Victorian.
Yeah, it looks like a rich man's house.
So that would have been a wealthy Long Islander's house. Not every, I'm not talking about the people who were the uber wealthy. I'm talking about a Long Islander. So Long Islanders, the people who lived here, their families did very well. One family is a town, there's a town called Smithtown.
Yeah.
And the Smith family did very well.
They sold land.
They sold land, and there were, and the Smiths are still part of the Long Island culture, and they were very involved. They were part of the Smith family was very involved in the Gilded Age. There were 3 sisters, and in one family, their father was a judge. And one of those sisters married the architect of the era, Stanford White. And Stanford White and his partners at McKim, Mead and White had designed many of the homes and the buildings, the grand buildings of the Gilded Age. And so they had so these a Long Island family was very much part of the Gilded Age. So Long Islanders, as they became more wealthy, became part of the culture of the Gilded Age as well.
Very, very, very interesting. Did World War I had any impact on Long Island in particular?
Sure. Well, let me just share with you that because of all the growth economic development on Long Island during that period, and also the growth in New York, there was an increasing demand for farm goods and products from Long Island for New York City. So Long Island became much more a conduit to New York, and therefore there was more economic dependency on New York. And so so there was a requirement or a need for many more immigrants. And so now you start to see people from Eastern Europe, Italy, and Spain, and so that was the beginning of a much larger migration.
Okay, that's very interesting to know, and we will talk more about it on the other side of the break. The way forward is ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਫਿਰ ਤੋਂ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ host Harjot Singh. So Joe, before going to the break, you mentioned that because of all these developments that New York was seeing, there was felt a need for more immigrants. We'll talk more about that later. But before that, I want to ask you. We talk about the Gilded Age, and we talk about all these rich people that New York had. Other than creating wealth, did New York have any other impact on the rest of the country?
Well, sure. In addition to wealth, Long Island played a significant role in our government. There's a Long Islander. I mean, some people argue he was born in New York City, but Teddy Roosevelt was from a Dutch family, and he made a huge impact in our culture. And one thing that a lot of Long Islanders don't even realize is that he played host to George Washington Carver, a black man who was a leader at the time, and is founder of Tuskegee, and a gentleman who actually bought a house on Long Island, and this your viewers are seeing it right now.
Oh, that's his house?
And that's his house in the Fort Salonga section of Northport, and that's Long Island Sound in front on the other side of the house. So this is actually the back of the house. Any house that's on the water, you have the front facing the water, and so this is where he lived, and he was the first black man to be and a former slave to be a guest of a president for dinner at the White House. And he was a guest of his neighbor in nearby Oyster Bay, of Teddy Roosevelt, who is president of the United States. And I'd like to show you Teddy Roosevelt's house in Sagamore Hill, which is, that's the name of the estate, and it was in Oyster Bay. You can see the president had a much larger home. And he's a perfect example of Long Islanders who had become part of the Gilded Age and were able to have large homes. And again, I just want to mention how Teddy Roosevelt is one of the greatest presidents in the United States, according to our history. At least he has his face etched into Mount Rushmore. He's often quoted. He was his niece, Eleanor Roosevelt, became First Lady and had married a cousin, Franklin Roosevelt. So they had a huge impact in our government and how our country went and forward. And so Long Island played a very large role, not only in the economy but also in our government. Interesting about Sagamore Hill is the fact that they hired a lot of housekeepers who were Scottish Irish, and so they were bringing they worked with their local church that brought immigrant girls to the United States, and they worked as maids at Sagamore Hill.
So there was a lot of immigration at the turn of the century. Where were these people mostly coming from?
Well, Ireland again. Things were happening in Ireland. There was the potato famine, and so Ireland continued to supply immigrants here. But there was also, because of these estates, there was a need for stone workers. People wanted great mansions with marble, and so there was a population of stone workers from Italy that came. And so Long Island now has a very, very significant Italian population. And so originally they came to help build these great estates and to serve as landscapers as well, and to build the grapevines and the vineyards and the orchards on these estates.
And when the Italians came, they were shown some resistance as well.
Yes, they were shown resistance as well. They were segregated more than anything. They weren't considered white, and so I don't know what they were considered, but they weren't considered white. What I would call WASP today, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and that was still the predominant culture on Long Island. But Long Island now had all this influx of other nationalities. So German was still here and still coming. The Italians, the Irish, and Eastern Europeans, and more Jews.
But they were mostly whites, because there were laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act or the Hindu Prohibition Act, which prohibited non-whites from coming into the country, and that changed with the civil rights movement in the 60s. Is it right?
It sure did. I mean, a lot of things changed with the civil rights law that Lyndon Johnson signed through in 1964, I think it is. But that's jumping a little bit ahead. But
we'll talk about that. Again, 20s was a great time of progress for the United States before we hit the Great Depression. We, not being political here, but we have a Republican president and the Republican Congress for the first time, right? Together. So, how did New York do in the 20s?
In the 1920s, it was a roaring 20s. So, let's put it in perspective. The Gilded Age was go, 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 make money, and then we had the First World War. And so the First World War took many Long Islanders into a bizarre situation. The culture of Long Island was very similar to the rest of the country, but there was a certain amount of privilege and comfort and peace on Long Island. Now they went off to war. And when they came back, it changed the attitude of society. And so the roaring 20s came roaring in. There was a new generation of younger people, and there was still a lot of wealth. So we're talking about a younger generation of these Gilded Age families, and so this wealthy generation of young people continued to spend on Long Island and continued to build more homes and more mansions and more estates.
The Great Gatsby.
Yes, that was the era of the Great Gatsby. And so what happened is there was still more of a demand for more immigrants to come here to work on their estates and to also then work in this growing economy on Long Island. I mean, everything grew because of it. You had to build more roads, you had to, more people were taking the railroad, so everything was growing.
So was New York hit bad, Long Island particularly, by the Great Depression?
Well, then that's a whole nother story. So yes, excuse me, but the Great Depression came in, but I do want to tell you one thing that affected a culture on Long Island that we don't talk about too much in the 20s, and that was the Prohibition. And Prohibition came in, and the German population on Long Island were brewers. There were a lot of beer gardens, and they made a living. My family, in particular, was one of them. And so with Prohibition, all of a sudden, my grandfather and his brothers, who worked in their family brewery, now had no job. And so it was very interesting. It affected the German population in a very interesting way. And so, and the Irish population during the 20s made a lot of money by bootlegging on Long Island. So there was it was really easy to bootleg, apparently, especially along the waterfront. So when the Depression came, now every migrant group was hurt, and also the Great Depression ceased the construction of these grand estates, and the people who lived in these grand estates had to let a lot of their staff go, and it became more difficult to afford to live in that luxury that they had in the past. And so there was a decline, or actually people just stopped building these grand estates, which had fueled the Long Island economy for a long time. And so now the Depression turned more people towards agriculture, and there was a large influx of Polish immigrants, and the Polish immigrants were very responsible for the Long Island potato industry, and also the cucumber industry, which were pickling, and also Long Island duck industry. So there was for many years, Long Island ducks were a delicacy. So that's what happened during the Depression. So there was this whole shift towards agriculture. And of course, New York City, which kept growing, even in tougher times, needed food. And so Long Island became a supplier of that food, and that's how people survived here.
Now, at Long Island, the whole of New York, and particularly Long Island, has had a long tradition of sending its children into military. Even the Union Army, I understand, the highest number of military men came from New York, right? Now comes Second World War, which I'm sure had a huge impact on people's lives, because a lot of people from Long Island particularly went to that war. We will talk more about that after a short break. ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਰਹੋ The Way Forward. The Way Forward is ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਫਿਰ ਤੋਂ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਹੋਸਟ ਹਰਜੋਤ ਸਿੰਘ। So Joe, you talked of Great Depression, and you said that people stopped building those affluent houses, those big houses, so that all that had an impact. Did it show in the architecture, in the houses they were living in?
Sure, absolutely. These great mansions and started, instead they were replaced by other houses. I'll give you an example. Garden City, Long Island is a planned community. Was started as by A.T. Stewart and his family. They had it was planned as part of the era of the Gilded Age, but then people started building these more humble homes. Here's a perfect example of a house in the 1920s in Manhasset, and this is a classic example. This is the Manhasset house. Now I'll show you a classic example of a row house that you might have found in Queens. So these are the kind of houses that were now being built. So they were building these huge mansions before, and now they were staying with these more humble homes. So we were talking before the break about Long Islanders and how their commitment to the World War. So they were living. These young men and women who went off to war in World War II were living in those kinds of houses. Now their family was a little bit more toned down. These are beautiful homes today. That first house I showed you, well, all those houses sell for probably over $1 million. But back then they were considered classic standard homes, and that was a reflection of the society. People thought they were scaling back. Now, of course, that's not necessarily scaling back, and we'll see more of that later. But how after World War II that changed. But right now, I just would like to answer a question you had asked in the previous segment, and that was regarding people going off to war.
Yeah.
And so the war really did affect Long Island in many ways, but it also created a new economy. In the last segment, before the break, we talked about how Long Island's economy now was really agrarian. We were growing the food for New York City, and now the economy shifted because we got involved in the war effort. One thing that Long Island is particularly known for was the fact that it played a significant role in the aerospace industry very early on. There was a bicycle store, still is, a bicycle store in Mineola called the Mineola Bicycle Shop. And that was sort of the home of all these people who wanted to build airplanes. And the airstrip at Roosevelt Field is where Lindbergh took off from when he flew in the 1920s to Paris, and his transatlantic flight started here on Long Island. So now we're getting into World War II, and there was this whole industry that was growing on Long Island in aeronautics, and there were many corporations that grew out of the war. And they built all the airplanes for World War II, and there were numerous companies here. And then, so that really drove the economy on Long Island through the World War II period,
so
and beyond.
Yeah. So after the Second World War, do you see that as a period of rapid growth for Long Island?
Well, yes. After the Second World War, the Long Island changed in a way that it has never had a change so significant, and it would never go back. Long Island was pastoral in many areas, and a lot of farmland and a lot of open space, and instead, housing boomed on Long Island, and so it created a total shift in who was coming here to live. And people came out of World War II, and people came from all over the world to live on Long Island. There were refugees from Europe. There were people from who had lived in other parts of the country, and then came here to work in the aeronautics industries.
Yeah. And I mentioned a lot of Long Islanders going into military, serving during Second World War as well. Lot of them benefited from the GI Bill.
Yeah.
That had a huge impact on Long Island. Is that right?
Sure. The GI Bill allowed people who probably wouldn't have been able to afford to buy a house to buy a house. And also to go to
education,
college. Yeah. So it spurred the growth of a number of colleges on Long Island, and it also spurred a housing boom. But and I'd like to show you a classic house of that period. There's a Cape Cod style house. It's called the classic Cape Cod. It's a little white house that you would see. It's very similar to the style of house that Levitt built in what's called Levittown, but this is one of the earlier houses, and Long Island is speckled throughout by homes that look like this, and the GI Bill allowed people to buy this. Now, if you recall the houses I showed you just a few minutes ago that people thought was scaled down, this is even more scaled down. This was less than 800 square feet, and many Long Islanders still live in these houses. So and many of these houses were built around the aeronautics industry, and so where the factories were, like in Bethpage and Plainview, Long Island, but now what's happening is we're attracting many people from all over the country and all over the world, and now we're facing an old culture that existed here on Long Island, that old WASP culture, and many people who were coming here were, refugees from Europe and parts of Europe that had not settled here on Long Island before. So there was a mindset after World War II, and Long Island, while there was a resistance to people who were not like the people who were here, there was also a welcoming and open arms, and Long Island became hugely diverse. And there was now an introduction of people of many different religions and many different cultures coming here.
While as we sit in 2022, we see Long Island as being this, this melting pot that we talk about, but Long Island has had its history of not being so welcoming, as you keep mentioning from time to time. KKK is an organization which is not seen in a very favorable light in this country's history, and that has been very active on the island, and it has had history of conflict with various religions, nationalities. Can you throw a little light on that?
Well, yeah, and the people who were members of it didn't see it negatively. They saw it as very positive. They saw it as being something that they had a right to. That, you know, there was sort of this sense like, well, our families were here before your family, so we have the right, and you don't. And so the KKK really started coming to the forefront on Long Island in the 1920s, and it continued all the way up until World War II. And at the time, they weren't necessarily, there wasn't this huge black population here. You know, we often think of the KKK being anti-black, and that tends to be more in the South. But here on Long Island, it was really anti-Catholic. And because many of the immigrants who were coming here from Europe before World War II and then after World War II were Catholic, and all of a sudden the Catholic Church expanded on Long Island. There really weren't very many Catholic churches on Long Island prior to the 1920s, and then it started to grow after that, and really grew after that, to the point now today I think that most Long Islanders would probably say Jews and Catholics are the two largest religious groups on Long Island, and that was not the case prior to the 1920s.
Yeah, that's very interesting to know, and a very important history that we shouldn't overlook. You know, there are a few more interesting things that we would like to know from you, but we'll talk about them after a short break. ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਰਹੋ The Way Forward. The Way Forward ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਫਿਰ ਤੋਂ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ host ਹਰਜੋਤ ਸਿੰਘ। ਜੋ we are in the last segment now, you know, we have talked about so much about so many immigrants coming in. We have talked about, you know, the populations that were here before, you know, outsiders came. We have talked about the economy, the politics of Long Island. What I want to talk about now is this beautiful society that Long Island now is, right? I think it's very diverse. It's very accepting. At least that's my experience. You know, I look like an outsider. I don't think I look like somebody who was here in the 17 or 1800s,
no,
right?
No.
But I have received nothing but love and acceptance wherever I've lived. I live on Long Island. And this all changed after the civil rights movement after 1964. Before that, you know, non-whites, it was not very easy for them to, you know, immigrate into this country. And as you say, we see those changes. We see those religious places, you know, of other cultures, the Sikhs, the Hindus. That's a Sikh Gurdwara in Plainview, Long Island. Then we have, you know, we have mosques, and as you said, these buildings don't look like typical, you know, that's the Asa Mai Mandir again in Hicksville, Long Island. These buildings don't look like those typical churches that were here.
Like what we saw in the first episode last week, that classic white church. And, you know, those churches still exist, but there are a lot more of your religious locations growing on Long Island. And it's so different from even 25 years ago. It's just a different place. And World War II started it here on Long Island, not necessarily in the rest of the country, but here on Long Island, we had so many refugees coming here, and people from different parts of the world. There were already Jews here, and then many more Jews came to live on Long Island. In addition to that, the civil rights era in 1964 and following that did, in fact, as you mentioned, shift things. And now there were no longer, legally, you could not restrict neighborhoods. In the past, you could, and that doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but now it's not as likely. I know where you live. You live next to people of every color and ethnicity and background live in your neighborhood, as many neighborhoods on Long Island. So it's totally shifted. We now have, I would say there was a big movement in the 70s and 80s where you saw a lot of people from Japan coming here. Certainly the Puerto Rican population was always here because it's part of the United States, but the Dominican population has shifted. We now have many more Dominicans coming to here. The Central American population has occurred. Since 1990, we now have Mexicans here. We didn't have Mexicans here on Long Island. You couldn't get a Mexican restaurant would have been Taco Bell. Now you can get great Mexican food. That didn't exist before. And of course, Cubans came here after the Cuban crisis in the 60s. And now South Asians have been coming since, I think, the 70s. It's really been a dramatic increase when I'll tell you, I grew up in a neighborhood in Nassau County, a town called Herrick's. And when I was growing up, it was predominantly a Jewish neighborhood. And when we went to sell my mother's house a couple of years ago after she had passed away, the realtor said, I'm betting you that we sell the house to a South Asian family. And I was like, really? And the whole neighborhood now is very mixed. And yes, we did sell the house to a South Asian family. And it's the whole island has shifted and changed, and it's very integrated. And one of the best parts of that is the fact that you can get all sorts of great food anywhere. So, as I think that shows. We say we don't close our eyes to what has happened in the past. We don't overlook. Yes, we have had history like in towns like Levittown, redlining and all, where they said that you couldn't, if you were not white, you couldn't buy houses in those areas. But we have come a long way. And as New York claims, there is, I would say, no nationality or no cuisine in the world which we can't find in New York, right? Right. Oh, I'm
hungry now.
Yeah, I'm hungry. I'm hungry. Food is we haven't really talked much about food in this series, and food is a very important part of culture. Economy, how people live, religion, language, but food. That's a big part. And I think today, if you come to Long Island, probably the most important thing about the understanding the culture of Long Island is dining. Excuse me.
Yeah, and you don't have to travel too far to get whatever food you want, right?
Right. So you can pray the way you want, you can eat the way you want, and you can speak the language you want. It seems like an amazing change and shift in how Long Island was when we first started, and here we are today.
We have recently seen certain politics which appears as a backlash to this growing numbers of what some people perceive as outsiders. Do you think that trend growing, or do you think that was just an exception to the rule?
Well, I think it's human nature. people always like to exclude people that they don't feel comfortable with. I think it's human nature to oppress others, and it's also human nature to embrace people you don't know. It's also human nature to love people you don't, to love people, and it's also human nature to want to get to know people and understand people. So, you know, it's you'll never get rid of prejudice, but you don't have to be controlled by it or live with it. So, it's your choice. Actually, a woman who lived in South Asia, in India, Mother Teresa was once asked if she was going to join this anti-violence protest, and she said, "No, I'm just going to pray for peace." So it's all about how you want to approach your life, and so I don't mean to sound like the world is all rosy, but the fact is, yes, there's always going to be people who oppress you. And that's sad, but you don't have to be ruled by it.
Yeah, we see all kinds of people at all times. You know, we remember those lines from was Dickens who said it was the best of time, then it was the worst of times.
Yes.
Yes. So that's an eternal truth. Joe, we are so thankful for your time. These you know, 2 sessions have been so enlightening. It's so important, you know, as we say again and again, we are new kids on the block, and it's very important for us to understand the social fabric. You know, we can make money, we can survive, we can thrive, but being part of the social fabric, being integrated into the society is very important. And thank you for helping us learn that.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. Obviously I'm a big fan of many cultures, so thank you.
ਇਹ ਸੀ ਸਾਡਾ ਸ਼ੋਅ। ਆਈ ਹੋਪ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਸਾਰੀ ਗੱਲ ਮੇਰੇ ਧਿਆਨ ਨਾਲ ਸੁਣੀ ਹੋਣੀ ਹੈ, ਕਈ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਸਿੱਖੀ ਹੋਣਗੀਆਂ। ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹ ਫੈਬਰਿਕ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਅੱਜ ਆਪਾਂ ਪਹੁੰਚੇ ਹਾਂ 2022 ਵਿੱਚ, ਇਸ ਦੇ ਪਿੱਛੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਹੈ। ਇਹ ਕਈ ਵਾਰ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਯੂ ਗੋ 2 steps forward and you go 1 step back, ਬਟ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰੈਸ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਹੈ, ਡਿਫਿਕਲਟੀਜ਼ ਆਉਂਦੀਆਂ, ਬਟ ਆਪਾਂ ਮਿਲ ਕੇ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਅੱਗੇ ਦੀ ਤਰਫ, ਬਿਹਤਰੀ ਦੀ ਤਰਫ ਲੈ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਔਰ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਇਸ ਸੋਸਾਇਟੀ ਨੂੰ ਕੰਟਰੀਬਿਊਟ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਇਹ ਅਸੀਂ ਦੇਖੀਏ। ਔਰ ਉਸ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਸੋਸਾਇਟੀ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਣਾ, ਉੱਥੇ ਦੇ ਕਲਚਰ ਨੂੰ, ਉੱਥੇ ਦੀ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਨੂੰ, ਉੱਥੇ ਦੀ ਪੋਲੀਟਿਕਸ ਨੂੰ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਹੈ। ਸਾਡਾ ਸ਼ੋਅ ਵੇਖਣ ਦਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ। ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਇੱਦਾਂ ਹੀ ਇਨਫੋਰਮੇਟਿਵ, ਐਂਟਰਟੇਨਿੰਗ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਰਹਾਂਗੇ। ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਰਹੋ ਦ ਵੇ ਫਾਰਵਰਡ।